Welcome to Justice and Judgment with Chris. Today, my special guest is Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis. Bob has come out with a new book, Being Prepared for World War III. And Bob, I think it's a timely book. I found it fascinating, and I want to thank you for joining our show this morning.
Well, thanks, Chris. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
My first question, and it may be kind of ironic, but what led you to write this book, and why now? Was it the leading of the Holy Spirit? Was it the situation you see us getting into?
Yeah, I think anytime a Christian is making decisions, they certainly have to rely upon the Spirit of God to direct those decisions. And I think that that's the case here as well. Yeah, keep in mind, Chris, this is my 12th book, and I've contributed to other books as well. But past books, such as Alliance of Evil in 2018, I said that it was a new Cold War taking place. And a lot of people were skeptical then, but today I think most people have come around to that understanding. Certainly, I wrote Give Me Liberty, Not Marxism, and the influence of Marxism in our culture. I wrote the book in 2019, Progressive Evil, and I certainly believe that the progressives in our country, which are in many cases very Marxist in their beliefs, have taken over institutions such as education and have really twisted the purpose of education, and they've tried to inculcate their radical beliefs into our culture. And we see that today, certainly lived out by the Biden administration. And then, of course, I wrote a book, Divided We Stand, and how divided our country is. And then this particular book, because of what I do during the day, and I'm in the arms business for the Department of the Army. And of course, I've been working on national security for 55 years since I first went to West Point in 1969. That all of these issues seem to collapse and form a very clear picture to me that we're heading, if we don't soon veer from that path, toward World War III. And so when I wrote this book, I recognized that all the indicators of the past two world wars, beginning in 1914 with World War I and 1941 for us, at least, in World War II, all the indicators and all the causes that are attributed to those global catastrophes were evidenced today. So, that's kind of why I did it. I wanted certainly the Christian community to understand what we're facing. And then, of course, as you know, in Section 6 of Preparing for World War II or World War III, I address the prophetic issues that are involved. And so there's a lot here, but it's important for people to understand.
Absolutely. There is a lot to unpack in this book, perusing through it. And congratulations on your 12th book. And after you went back, and I've got all those books you mentioned, you have kind of built a stepping stone up to this book. I believe that's what it appears to me anyway. And you've kind of paved the way for a better understanding.
Well, there's a lot to this, and clearly, the sociology of our country, the demographic nature of our country, the politics you can't set aside. You have to understand what's happening in other nations. When I wrote Kings of the East a few years ago about China, most people don't really appreciate, that it is a communist country and that they have a very hegemonic view of the world. They think they are the Middle Kingdom and they want to dominate. And then, of course, you have to understand the Soviet Union as well as the Russian Federation that morphed from that to the present day leadership of Vladimir Putin. All of this has broad, I think, prophetic implications for the future. And so I'm trying to paint a picture over the years as I've written this series of a dozen books for people to appreciate that these pieces, they may not seem to fit, but they do fit, and they paint a very dramatic picture for our future.
Well, I agree with you that it's like a perfect puzzle. They all the pieces seem to come together, and I don't know, Bob, if it was in the first chapter or in the preface where you talk about, the spark of China, the spark of Russia, the spark of the Muslim religion. And we seem to have this three-pronged enemy coming at us, and it's uncertain of which one's going to hit us first.
Yeah, it's, I wrote a book, Never Submit, which was about the genocide of Christians in the Middle East. And of course, I had to do a deep dive into Islam and explain the background. It wasn't until the 700s that Muhammad, arose from the deserts, the Saudi deserts, and, started to contest Christianity and, of course, Judaism. Uh, but it's really a manifestation of an evil, pervasive nature to oppose the rise of Christianity across the world. And so, from the 700s, up to the present time, we've seen, the expansion of Islam, which I think has just a solid evil foundation.
Right.
And of course, it opposes anything that embraces the Word of God, which of course is evident in the Middle East and across even a growing swath of the world. That said, then you look at what happened in the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation today and the like, and the emergence of a tyrant like Vladimir Putin, and how he is very hegemonic for the recovery of the old czarist empire of the Russia of the 19th century. And then, of course, you go through a series of empires and rulership of China over thousands of years, and how they're very hegemonic. And you throw into this mix, which is rather interesting, all the sophistication and technology of today. And so you've promoted these evil intents by three different entities that are now collaborating with one another to a large degree. The Irans, China, Russia, North Korea, and other tyrants, to include even the Saudis, I'd argue, into a volatile mix. And then you have a very distressing world setting that could very easily explode.
Absolutely. I look at it as a bad stew with all the wrong ingredients, and it's about to bubble over.
Yeah.
That's kind of
No,
the picture I get. So, and like I said, there's so much we could cover, but what is going to be different from this war than from all the other previous wars, like World War One, World War Two, Vietnam? What is going to be different that people probably aren't expecting?
well, certainly the geopolitics is, back and forth. I think the technology is something that people, that are privy to technological changes, begin to appreciate how dangerous things are. Certainly in the Cold War, we have the arsenal of the atomic weapon that proliferated, during certainly the 50s through the 90s and the demise of the Soviet Union. But those major weapon systems haven't gone away. All they've done is proliferate. So today, the Russians have been modernizing their arsenal. We've been hoping they've been more restrained, but they aren't. The Chinese are modernizing their nuclear arsenal, and they'll probably outdistance us at the current rate of production and modernization by the 2030s. Then, of course, North Korea has its own arsenal. Arguably, the Iranians have the substance and the means and perhaps the technology to produce theirs, as we've heard from the Israelis and their concern about what might morph there. But it's not just the nuclear stuff. You've got an all-domain battlefield. Certainly look at outer space. The Chinese are incredibly ambitious, having every intent to occupy the moon and then to extend it beyond there. But outer space, beyond our atmosphere, where they have technologies to disable our own satellite systems to attack them, both from the ground using directed energy weapons, lasers, out to 20,000 miles perhaps. And then, of course, they have vehicles that can disable satellites and the like. So that's a new battlefield. The cyber battlefield, we're constantly battling Chinese hackers that are very well organized and part of their military. And the same thing with the Russians, same thing with the North Koreans, Iranians, and others that attack our infrastructure, attack our cyber systems. And then, of course, ground combat. We've seen in Ukraine a radical transformation, especially using drones and the technology that drones bring to the battlefield, both for reconnaissance, resupply, and then, of course, as directed capabilities, you delivering packages that destroy ground forces, as well as ballistic missiles that can accurately target things within a few inches. All of this technology, which I, of course, deal with in great detail in the book, you need to understand has transformed, the modern battlefield into something we've never seen before. I think my concern, as I address it in the book, Chris, is that in World War I, World War II, we did not really directly suffer as a nation here in our homeland the effects of the battles. That I think is rapidly going to change in the future. We've already suffering some of the impacts from on the fringes of what that war may look like, through cyber, through the threats to our infrastructure, our electricity, our water, our food supplies, our medicines. All of this is a transformation of thinking that we must go through to prepare for the potential, the real potential, I think, of the effects of the future war here in the homeland. And of course, it will be devastating. And I try to capture, the effects on, the typical civilian. And I go through not only what's happening to civilians in Ukraine, but elsewhere, historically. These are things that people don't want to think about, but unfortunately, we must think about.
Absolutely. And what you said brought me to my third question was, or actually fourth one. We haven't really had any major World War I, World War II effect here in this nation as far as being on our soil. And, could that change? And going through the book, Unrestricted Warfare, I feel like it's already on our soil with the cyber attacks, but could that go kinetic?
Oh, no doubt. We were humbled by the 9/11 attacks on the Pentagon, the World Trade Center, and of course the down plane in Pennsylvania. But that's only a tip of the iceberg. What could happen here is not only cyber, but the use of of a nuclear weapon going off in our atmosphere and destroying all our electronics. No cell phones, arguably no electricity. Nothing. Uh, we would be forced back into the Stone Age. That's the sort of thing that I'm concerned about, and I don't think it's out of the reason to understand. Our enemies would be more than willing to do that, believing that they could, be successful. I would argue that the infiltration of progressive thinking, so-called progressive thinking, which is really Marxist thinking, leveraged by the likes of President Xi Jinping of China in America. Just think about the unfettered access that we've had of Chinese agents in this country, either thanks to an open border policy by the likes of Biden, or our naive thinking that by inviting tens and hundreds of thousands of Chinese students to our universities was not mitigating or influencing the loss of technology to that nation, and they would use that technology against us. So the whole idea of irregular warfare, which is something Mao Zedong embraced, 70, 80 years ago, when they formed the Republic of China, or the People's Republic of China, is something that we've been incredibly stupid about over the years, and they fulfilled, I believe, a very effective way. They're paying us back for our stupidity and being naive about what the true intents of a Marxist regime is, and that's what we're battling today. They may have tenets of capitalism, but it's not a capitalistic country. And of course, they're alliances with nations across the world, which they're gobbling up quickly, whether it's in South America, Africa, Europe, Oceania, you name it. They're garnering all sorts of allies and people that they can manipulate. That this makes the probability of a future confrontation ever more present today than it has been, I would argue, at any time in the history of the United States.
Well, you bring that up. It's called the Belt and Road Initiative. Is that correct?
Well,
And
that's certainly one of the programs that affects 150 nations around the world. What do we have? 190 nations, and they're having their influence, even though the Chinese have challenges. And of course, there are a lot of apologists out there that says, no, China is just, a bit clumsy about what it does. Not really. I would argue that it's very clear what President Xi has in mind. Read his speeches, understand his actions, and you'd come to a very different conclusion, as I did when I wrote Kings of the East.
well, it to me, what I'm seeing is a perfect plan of attack where they're coming in, with their 150 nations, their Belt and Road Initiative. They've kind of taken over with the cyber attacks, I think. And then you look at what is coming across our border. Michael Yon, I listened to some of what he says. I don't agree with everything he talks about, but he is completely aware of the number of Chinese coming across our border, and these are all military age men, 95% of them. And some of them are just flying in. Some of them, they've got their own station set up down there in the Darien Gap. And I just don't think that the American people, and I have a clue of what is actually going on. And I sometimes wonder if the Congress and Senate up there knows what's going on, is just blatantly ignoring it. For what reason, I don't know.
There's it is disconcerting that we seem to be naively in a stupor about the intents of foreign governments that would like to take advantage of us or to actually take over, given the opportunity. And we've let our guard down. And so as a result, these things are happening. The infiltration of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of military age men into this country is not an accident. It's on purpose. It's the whole idea of unrestricted warfare and using every mechanism of government to defeat your adversaries. And that's precisely what Beijing is doing. To think otherwise, I think, is incredibly naive, putting your head in the sand. And we need to recognize where we live and the time of what we're facing today. We live in an evil, spiritually evil world, and our enemies want to conquer us and will use every mechanism they can.
Well, you bring me to this point here. What is the church's responsibility in this? In chapter 13, and I think it's section 3, you talk about the Black Robe Regiment back during the Civil War, and our and I don't want to offend our pastors out there, but are they being lackadaisical in the pulpit and not speaking the truth of where we're at and preparing the church and commanding the church to pray?
Well, certainly during the Revolutionary War, the British, blamed the pastors of America for the ultimate victory that the United States, the colonies, enjoyed over the British Army. And it's because they stood in their pulpits and they declared that Britain, the monarchy, was not doing the things that was, in the interest of the colonists. They were basically uh, in, impressing on us, their rulership. They were taking from us taxation. They were insisting that we didn't have any freedoms, across the board. And I would argue that, a few pastors, for the recent election that pitted Mr. Trump against Mr. or Miss Harris and so forth, there was a clear delineation between what the intent of one was versus the other. Miss Harris arguably represented, everything that I oppose. And so I know my pastor and others that I'm aware of, Chris, stood in the pulpit and declared the truth about what we were facing. It, it was starkly clear when it comes to certainly the life issues, the whole transgender mess, the abuse of our freedoms. All of those were on the table, and so pastors that didn't stand up and declare that the emperor, in this case, the Democratic Party that was representing so much evil, should be disenfranchised and kicked out and replaced by at least, not that Mr. Trump and the Republicans are all, biblical, apologists, but they represented a set of values that were certainly better aligned with my Christian views than certainly the Democrats. So, these are the sorts of things that we need to hear from our pastors. You go to the scriptures, uh, do proper exegesis of what the scriptures say when it comes to what Romans 13 and other passages declare regarding the role of government. And we need to do that. Now, as far as the individual is concerned, we're all about being Christ-like in a world that's fallen, and clearly our world is fallen given the culture, and we need to be about sharing the gospel with the lost, believing that the end times, whether they're tomorrow or in 1,000 years, we need to be sharing the good news of Christ. So, if we face an imminent world war, as I tend to believe we're certainly hedging in that direction. We didn't anticipate World War I, World War II, and I do believe the end times will be ushered in by a global world war. What I don't know, and I declare in this book the details of whether we're going to have other global wars prior to the final global war that ushers in Christ, the 1,000-year reign, and all that. I don't know. I contest that nobody knows, because
Absolutely.
God said He doesn't. He hasn't declared that. Only He knows.
Uh, Absolutely. And I was going to ask you, do you feel this war is imminent or can it be avoided? But and I'm just going to give you my point of view. I have that hope in Christ, but I don't I don't believe that this is avoidable. And we need to maintain that hope in Christ and pray that we are safe under the shadow of God's wings. What brings me to ask you, if war was to hit our country, if we were to have it in our streets, what is the responsibility of a Christian believer who believes in the love of God and sharing the gospel of Christ, but also has an obligation to defend his homeland?
Yeah. Well, as you know, I've dealt with that in the book. First, I want to disabuse people of thinking that our armed forces is as capable as some of us would like to believe. It's not. I go through great detail of the analysis of where we are today, and our adversaries are very formidable. Not supermen, but they're very formidable. when you compare, the coalition of evil nations, the Chinese, the Russians, and others, and compare that with our capabilities. Technology has really transitioned here, to a point that you need to appreciate what it's doing to us today, and how it's really threatening. I would argue that Christian in this possible future war needs to prepare themselves and their families and their communities. They need to recognize that uh, it can come down to you and your family and your local community. I hate to think that we would lose control of our nation, but I don't rule that out. Uh, I'm not a arguably one of these super preppers, but I do deal with how to prepare yourself in some significant detail in there. Prepare yourself secularly, and through doing all the right sorts of things to stock up and the like. The unfortunate thing is that wars tend to last long periods of time, as I illustrate with some of the venues in the book. I talk about how others have survived or not survived when their communities were taken over by adversaries. Now, of course, will our communities be taken over by adversaries? Possibly not. They may hold us hostage from a distance with various types of weapons and control of our infrastructure. All of these issues, I think, are on the table. Um, and if you don't believe it, I would argue that people would be incredibly naive about the technologies that we face today, and even internally, how corrupt our streets have become with criminals and the like, and we can't even control our own borders. So, yeah, these are issues of great consequence. And that's why I would say that you need to have your own local community, preferably a church community that is binding together and thinking about, these tenuous times that we live in. In a recent broadcast and the taping I did at Skywatch about, whether or not we've been naively coerced to believe that all our problems are going to go away once Mr. Trump takes office on the 20th of January. I'd like to believe that, but I don't.
Right.
Mr. Trump, unfortunately, is inheriting, the Biden administration's disastrous oversight of the United States. And of course, their free spending, open border, just absolutely bankrupt foreign policy. To fix all of that, it's not going to be something that's going to be easy nor quick, if it can, in fact, be done. And so we need to recognize that these are dangerous times, to say the least. And so, and our enemies know that as well. They're taking the calculation as to how resilient the United States is. Are we prepared to face sacrifice? And arguably, we haven't, really sacrificed as a nation since, World War II, when though we didn't have the battlefield in our own backyard, we did have to sacrifice financially. And
Right.
unfortunately, I don't see that we've got that resilience, much less that cohesiveness as a nation that we once had. So you've got all these factors that are in play. I've written about them on and off over the last decade plus. And this effort on preparing for World War III has so many tentacles that you need to appreciate those tentacles before I think a lot of people will come to the conclusion that I'm right.
Well, one thing I believe, and you may want to expound on this a little bit more, is our technology is probably going to be used against us, or just the lack thereof, if we were to get hit with uh, Bob, Frank Gaffney was discussing about how they could shut down our electricity. Um, when I was a young man in my 20s, I had a long conversation with my great grandmother, who was a teenager through the Great Depression. And she let me know how difficult it was. And how being prepared for something like that again was very important, and that we can't just go on and think that everything's going to be hunky-dory and work the way they've always worked.
No, I think you're right. Certainly, the infrastructure issues are critical. Chinese have been attacking our infrastructure, have placed all sorts of malware inside of our computer systems, which have been, just incredibly lacking in firewalls. And so, they would only need to trigger some of these, you know, malware that they've planted in critical infrastructure to cause them to go belly up. And we recognize that the U.S. government has done many studies. Academics outside of government have confirmed this sort of thing. So, we face some real dire situations. Certainly, if for our grandparents and the like that lived in the Dust Bowl era, when we had nothing, you
Right.
know, we just aren't prepared for that reality. I've lived in, some rather, stark places. I lived in the far north in the central Alaska during the winter when, you know, we were threatened not to have anything to include electricity. And in the wilderness where you don't have those modern conveniences, you figure out in time, if you survive, how to live. Um, and that's what I think that, I try to emphasize in one of the chapters is you need to develop some techniques that, recognize when you lose modern conveniences, how do you make ends meet? How do you survive? Um, I hope it never comes to that, but I think even in disasters, whether it's hurricanes and we see people devastated and loss of life and so forth, these are things that common sense says you just have to learn so that in case the worst happens, you're prepared for it. I was thinking about, I was reading something today about our uh, and I think this is by design, the emptying of our arsenals for our military, the
Mhm.
industrial base issues. We haven't had a meaningful industrial base since the end of World War II. Yes, we've been able to modernize, but the decline in our ability to robustly refurbish uh, our arsenals was undermined significantly over the last couple of decades, and we've given away much of what we had to the battlefields in Ukraine and
Right.
certainly
Yes.
in Israel and elsewhere, and that's something that is a grave concern to me because we don't have the authorities nor the infrastructure like we had even in 1938 when President Roosevelt said, I want to change this Ford Motor car producing plant into a tank producing plant. We can't
Right.
do that easily.
The- Um, I remember that in your recent interview at Skywatch. It's not going to happen overnight, and you bring up President Trump. There's been the deck has been stacked against him when he comes into office. It's not going to be fixed overnight. It may take a decade to correct some of what the damages that they've done. So we may be getting by the skin of our teeth, which brings me to my final thought, and I shared this with you earlier. You know, General Washington, was a Christian and a praying man, and gave God the glory and sought God. And I was reading an article about General Patton and the prayer that he had a chaplain produce before the Battle of the Bulge. And these men were relying upon God's favor. And you talked about generals depending on AI to help their war strategies. And that just made me realize that we're leaving God completely out of the equation if they go to that road. And I thank God that we've got a president coming in who believes in prayer and readily allows clergy to pray for him. But do you see that as a real problem?
Well, certainly artificial intelligence is becoming a mechanism that the armed forces of every nation will eventually turn to because it makes decisions inside of a cycle that is much faster than we
Right.
humans. Now, it cuts God out, of course,
Yes.
because it relies upon artificial intelligence and these giant computers, quantum computers that think faster than we can think. And then, of course, uh, when you're in a pressure cooker of a decision cycle, and your nation is being attacked either by nuclear weapons or cyber weapons or space weapons and the like, you need all the help you can get. And so the tendency will be, as we've come to conclude in wargaming, that we need the decision timelines are shortened dramatically because of artificial intelligence aided decision making. And the Chinese are doing much work on AI. We are doing a great deal as well. The Russians are also, but it's the Chinese that are our primary adversary, and they're moving out quickly. So whether it's controlling actual weapon systems like drone swarms or using them for reconnaissance or delivery of weapons, or they're using space weapons that are controlled through artificial intelligence. All of this is something that most Americans don't even think about, but it's something we must think about. It's redefining the future of warfare of our entire civilization as human beings. And these are grave issues that we must consider. At the same time, as spirit filled Christians, we need to recognize that these are tools that can be used and abused. And that's the scary aspect of what we're dealing with here is that our adversaries are anti-God. They are not tethered to the scriptures as many of us are. And as a result, they're going to use every evil intent to undermine what we do. And so when George Washington, a believer, or George Patton, who directs his chaplain to write a prayer, these are things that we need to recognize that we're in a spiritual war against forces that are very serious and would do everything they could to undermine us.
Absolutely. I think Ephesians 6, the armor of God is more important now than ever before. I want to ask you one more final question. I guess it's a bonus question I didn't warn you about, but you brought it up twice now. These drones. As I told you earlier, I had just recently passed my FAA exam and got my drone license. It's going to be my second business that I've started. But I'm also aware that there are weight limits on the types of drones that I can use. And if I want something bigger, I have to get uh, a waiver for it. And the drones that are the size that they were saying, the size of SUVs, I've heard the size of buses, and I heard others discuss, Frank Gaffney for one, talking about. Of course, it seems he blames everything on China, which I tend to agree with him on that because they seem to be working harder at getting into our technologies and spying on us. And recently, there's been several Chinese men arrested for flying drones over military bases or high sensitive places. Do you have an opinion? Do you have a thought on what these are? Is it just a distraction to distract us from what's going on? Or is there something nefarious going on with these drones?
Well, like President Trump has said, the government likely knows. The sophistication of drones today, uh, and especially in China, which arguably leads the world in drone production from small to commercial level and to national security level. it has the ability to do all sorts of things using uh, unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, and of course, unfortunately, our counter UAS is not all that good yet. We've seen the proliferation of the use of drones all over the world. Certainly, the Iranians have been using them since the 80s and have effectively gone after targets in Saudi Arabia, Syria, Jordan, certainly in Israel in October and in
Yes.
April of this year.
Right.
Are they behind what's going on in the United States today? Well, they floated a balloon across the country in February of 2023, and the Biden
All the way
administration
across.
did nothing
Yeah.
until it was off the coast. And of course, they denied it all until it was off the coast for the most part. And is there some sort of thing, as a couple congressmen from New Jersey have argued, it might be foreign entities involved? I certainly could embrace that view as well until they prove otherwise.
Right.
Um, I don't think that these are alien vehicles that are coming here to operate and spy on us. I reject that at this point. I think
I do
that
too.
there are certainly uh, technologies that are available for that purpose.
What caught my attention, and if you believe the reports, that these drones had the ability, which makes sense if they were Chinese or Iranian, to cause other drones to fall out of the sky, and to do things that I don't know that I know that my drones don't have the ability to do, and which, by the way, are Chinese-made drones, and they're very adequate for, commercial is what I'm using them for. Bob, I'm going to give you the last word. If there's anything, any kind of encouragement or warning you'd like to give, I want to let you have the last say.
Well, I would encourage people to read Preparing for World War III because I think that it collapses a lot of the arguments I've made over the last decade or so in explaining the history, explaining the contemporary situation with the United States, our armed forces, but our other government agencies and efforts. And it explains from a Christian's perspective whether or not we're at the cusp of a future world war. Is this the future world war that's going to end all times and usher in the prophetic end times? Perhaps or perhaps not. And I make those arguments. Are kind of a twist here is China and Russia. Are they really the end times adversaries, or is there something even more daunting out there? And
Right.
that's a challenge we need to consider. So I would encourage people to pick it up and to consider the arguments in there because I think this is a bit of a twist, perhaps, than what you've read in the past.
All right. Well, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Maginnis, thank you so much for your time. The book is fantastic. I urge everyone to go out and read it and study it because there is so much information there, and I think it's very timely. And I appreciate your time this morning, sir.
Thanks, Chris. Have a great day.
All right, Bob. God bless you.